The Pacific Ocean in the summer of 1944 was no longer the same vast expanse where Japan had once reigned supreme. 2 years earlier, the empire's naval forces had surged across island chains, planting their flag over territories that stretched from the Asian mainland to the far reaches of the Pacific. But now, the tide had turned. American carriers, submarines, and waves of amphibious troops were steadily driving back the Japanese perimeter. Every month, another strategic outpost fell. One of the most important stages in this reversal was the Mariana Islands campaign. These small dots in the Pacific, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were more than just isolated tropical landscapes. They were stepping stones to Japan's very doorstep. Control of these islands would give the United States the ability to launch direct bombing raids on the Japanese homeland, something unthinkable at the war's beginning. The assault began with Saipan in June 1944. The Japanese knew its importance and fought with desperate ferocity. American Marines stormed ashore under relentless machine gun fire and artillery bursts from hidden positions. The beaches became a hell of smoke, blood, and shattered equipment. But by mid-July, Saipan was in American hands. The cost was staggering for both sides. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead, and tragically, many civilians had taken their own lives, convinced by imperial propaganda that capture meant unspeakable horrors. Tinian fell soon after, captured in late July with less resistance but no less importance. The airfields here would soon host the massive B-29 Superfortresses aircraft, capable of carrying the war directly to Tokyo. Guam, the largest of the Marianas and a former U.S. territory lost to Japan in 1941, was retaken by the end of August. Its liberation was not just a strategic gain, but also a symbolic one. With the Marianas secured, the United States held a forward base from which the Japanese home islands could be reached by air. But victory in the Pacific was never a single blow. It was a series of relentless steps, each requiring enormous resources and human sacrifice. The next targets lay to the west, where the Philippines awaited liberation and Japan's last defensive rings braced for the storm. The U.S. High Command, under Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific and General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific, was pushing forward in two massive thrusts. Nimitz's forces would continue the island-hopping strategy across the Central Ocean, while MacArthur advanced through New Guinea toward the Philippines. These twin offensives would soon converge, tightening the noose around Japan, but the Japanese Navy was not yet broken. Despite heavy losses at Midway and the Solomons, they still possessed powerful carriers, battleships, and a fierce determination to strike back. Their strategy now hinged on inflicting such heavy casualties on the Americans that Washington might reconsider its push toward unconditional surrender. This hope would soon be tested in one of the largest naval battles in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. For now, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. The Americans had seized the initiative, and Japan was fighting on the defensive. But every mile gained was costly, every victory soaked in blood. The road from Guam to Tokyo would be long, perilous, and marked by some of the most brutal combat of the entire war. By late 1944, the Philippines became the next great objective. For the Japanese, these islands were more than a colonial possession. They were a vital lifeline. The sea routes that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies, food from Southeast Asia, and raw materials from across their empire all passed through the waters around the Philippines. Losing them would strangle Japan's war machine. For the Americans, the liberation of the Philippines was both strategic and personal. General Douglas MacArthur had left these islands in 1942 under orders, famously vowing, "I shall return." With the momentum of victory behind him, he intended to keep that promise. The first step was to land on the island of Leyte. On October 20th, 1944, MacArthur waded ashore in the Gulf of Leyte, his landing captured by newsreel cameras that would become iconic. Around him, U.S. troops poured onto the beaches, supported by a vast armada. Offshore, hundreds of warships formed a protective ring, but they were about to be tested like never before. The Japanese, realizing the critical importance of Leyte, launched Operation Shoji, a massive, all-or-nothing naval counterattack. Their plan was bold: lure the American carriers away with a decoy force of largely empty carriers, while powerful surface fleets from the north and south would converge on Leyte Gulf and smash the vulnerable invasion fleet. What followed was the sprawling, chaotic Battle of Leyte Gulf, a 4-day struggle fought across hundreds of miles of ocean. Off the island of Samar, one of the most dramatic actions of the entire war unfolded. A small U.S. escort carrier group, known as Taffy 3, found itself facing the full power of a Japanese battleship force, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. What should have been a slaughter turned into a desperate and heroic stand. American destroyers and destroyer escorts charged into the fight, launching torpedoes and laying smokescreens while the tiny carriers frantically launched every plane they had, some armed only with machine guns or depth charges. The chaos and ferocity of the defense convinced the Japanese admiral he was facing a much larger force, and he unexpectedly withdrew. Elsewhere in the battle, the Japanese suffered catastrophic losses. Their decoy carriers were sunk, many of their battleships and cruisers destroyed, and their ability to conduct large-scale naval operations was crippled forever. Leyte Gulf was not just a defeat, it was the death blow to Japan's navy. With naval opposition shattered, the Americans could land reinforcements and supplies almost at will. The liberation of the Philippines was now inevitable, but far from easy. Fierce fighting erupted across the islands, from Leyte to Luzon, where the capital Manila would become the scene of one of the war's bloodiest urban battles. For Japan, the fall of the Philippines meant more than just a lost territory. It meant isolation. Without the flow of oil and resources, their ships and planes would soon be grounded. Yet the imperial leadership refused to consider surrender. Instead, they turned to new, desperate measures that would forever etch themselves into history. The kamikaze. Young Japanese pilots, barely trained and often still teenagers, were given just enough instruction to take off, navigate toward the enemy fleet, and deliberately crash their aircraft packed with explosives into Allied ships. The first major wave came in late October 1944 during the fighting for Leyte. American sailors watched in disbelief as enemy planes made no attempt to evade defensive fire, instead diving straight into the decks of carriers and destroyers. The impact was devastating. Even a single successful strike could set a ship ablaze, killing dozens and knocking it out of action. For the Japanese high command, kamikazes were seen as a last desperate weapon to offset the overwhelming American advantage in ships, planes, and industrial might. For the young pilots, it was a grim choice. Some were driven by intense nationalism, others coerced, and many were simply resigned to the inevitability of death. As the Philippines campaign dragged on, the cost in lives was staggering. Manila, once known as the Pearl of the Orient, became a ruined city. In February 1945, American and Filipino forces fought block by block, while trapped civilians suffered massacres and bombardments. By the time the city was liberated, it lay in ruins, with over 100,000 civilians dead. With the Philippines secured, the next stepping stone toward Japan was the island of Iwo Jima. Though small, it was of immense strategic value, a fighter base from which American bombers attacking Japan could have escort protection, and a haven for damaged planes returning from missions. In February 1945, the U.S. Marines landed under withering fire from a Japanese garrison dug deep into tunnels and bunkers. For 36 days, the battle raged in a hell of ash, smoke, and blood. Out of 21,000 Japanese defenders, nearly all fought to the death. The American flag raised atop Mount Suribachi became one of the most iconic images of the war. But the cost was immense, over 26,000 U.S. casualties. Yet even Iwo Jima was just a prelude to the final and bloodiest battle of the Pacific, Okinawa. Larger than Iwo Jima, closer to Japan, and heavily fortified, Okinawa was seen as the last hurdle before an invasion of the Japanese home islands. In April 1945, American forces came ashore, facing not just entrenched defenders, but the most intense kamikaze campaign of the war. Wave after wave of suicide planes struck the fleet offshore. Ships exploded or burned. Sailors fought fires for hours on end, sometimes for days. On land, the Japanese fought a grim, grinding defense, retreating slowly from one fortified line to the next. By the time Okinawa was declared secure in June, the toll was staggering. More than 12,000 Americans dead. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed, and tens of thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. The island was now in Allied hands. But the sheer cost raised a grim question. If Okinawa was this bloody, what would happen in an invasion of the Japanese mainland? That question was already being weighed by the highest levels of Allied command, and the answer would lead to one of the most controversial decisions in military history. By the summer of 1945, Japan's empire was crumbling. Its navy was gone, its air force crippled, and its once mighty army shattered across distant islands. Yet the nation still refused to surrender. The Allied plan for invasion, codenamed Operation Downfall, promised to be the largest amphibious assault in history, with projections of hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths. Even before such an invasion, American B-29 bombers had begun laying waste to Japanese cities. From bases in the Marianas and Iwo Jima, these massive planes dropped incendiary bombs that turned whole urban districts into firestorms. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya all suffered devastating attacks. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, the Tokyo raid killed an estimated 100,000 people, the deadliest single airstrike of the war. The skies above Japan glowed red with the reflection of burning cities. Yet Japan's leaders held on, hoping for better surrender terms or even Soviet mediation. The Allies, meanwhile, sought a decisive blow that could force an end without the horrors of a mainland invasion. That decision would come in the form of a weapon unlike any seen before: the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a lone B-29 named Enola Gay appeared over the city of Hiroshima at 8:15 a.m. It released its deadly cargo, a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. In a blinding flash and a thunderous roar, the heart of the city vanished. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more perished in the days and weeks that followed from burns and radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, fueled by plutonium, was dropped on Nagasaki. Another city was obliterated. The destruction was so complete that survivors spoke of it as if the earth itself had been torn open. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, launching a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Their forces swept aside the exhausted Japanese army in a matter of days. With atomic fire in the west and a Soviet juggernaut in the east, Japan's position was hopeless. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio, the first time his subjects had ever heard his voice. Speaking in formal, poetic language, he announced Japan's surrender, acknowledging the new and most cruel bomb and urging his people to endure the unendurable. The official signing of surrender took place on September 2, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, American generals, Allied officers, and Japanese delegates stood together on the deck as the war that had engulfed the world finally came to an end. For Japan, the end of the war meant the end of its imperial ambitions and the start of a long, painful rebuilding. Cities lay in ashes, millions were displaced, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would last for generations. For the United States and its allies, victory in the Pacific had come at a staggering price. Years of relentless fighting, hundreds of thousands of dead, and the unleashing of a weapon that would forever change the nature of warfare. The Pacific War was over. The world had entered the nuclear age, and in the smoldering ruins of empire, a new chapter of history was about to begin.